following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Cachetis, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. There's been an awful lot of talk about the Phillie Fanatics makeover recently. Well, what does it matter if the team's mascot gets thinner, his snout's smaller, and he wears different colored socks? Who cares? Philadelphians should care. That's who. The reason for the makeover is a lawsuit over copyright. And if the Phillies lose that lawsuit, theoretically, any sports franchise will be able to replicate the Fanatic for their own mascot. Truth is, the Phillie Fanatic is much more than a team mascot. He's a unique symbol of our city, its residents, and our feisty but genuinely caring spirit. Not even the Liberty Bell can make that claim. Since April 25, 1978, when the Fanatic made his debut at Veterans Stadium, Phillies fans have delighted in the lovable personality and crazy antics of the furry green creature from the Galapagos Islands. Like the fan base he represents, the Fanatic's pelvic thrusts are a G-rated way of flipping the bird to opponents. He instigates, cajoles, and gives a silent Philly salute with his long red tongue to every umpire who makes a bad call. But he also cares passionately about Phillies fans, especially youngsters who are struggling with an illness or a physical or intellectual disability. That's why he's made thousands of public relations and goodwill appearances at local hospitals, charity events, and fundraisers in the tri-state area. The Fanatic is Philadelphia, and the brotherly and sisterly love this city represents. Although the Fanatic was originally created to unite the fan base by appealing to our emotions and loyalty to the team, the furry green monster has also generated tremendous marketing feedback as well as hefty financial profits over the last 4 decades. Let's face it, Fanatic merchandise was and continues to be a hugely successful business for the Phillies. That's why the franchise has been engaged in an ongoing legal battle with creators Bonnie Erickson and Wade Harrison, who designed the Fanatic more than 40 years ago. In the mid-1970s, Bill Giles, then the Phillies vice president of business operations, contracted with Erickson and Harrison to create a team mascot. It was a stroke of genius. Giles, whose marketing plan targeted young families, wanted to attract more children to the ballpark with a furry-like creature along the same lines as Big Bird of Sesame Street fame. Erickson and Harrison were the ideal designers, having already worked with Jim Henson, creator of the Muppets. Giles also contracted with Erickson's and Harrison's New York design firm to create a mascot costume for $3,900. If he had paid another $1,300, the Phillies would have also controlled copyright ownership. But Giles, in what he later admitted was the worst decision of his career, chose to purchase the costume only. 5 years later, when Giles and his group of investors bought the team from the Carpenter family, the franchise paid $250,000 to Harrison Erickson for the copyright. So why did the Phillies file a lawsuit against the designers last summer? Because federal law allows artists to renegotiate their rights after 35 years. Erickson and Harrison seized that opportunity in 2018 when they sent the Phillies a notice of termination, claiming that their firm owned the copyright and retained the right to terminate the contract if the team and the company didn't reach a new agreement by June 15, 2020. The Phillies filed a lawsuit against Harrison Erickson last June, arguing that the 1984 renegotiation with the company transferred the copyright forever. The team also insists that it invented the character and personality of the Fanatic, not just the costume, which reinforces their claim to copyright status. To improve their chances for a legal victory, the Phillies recently made some minor changes to the Fanatic's costume, which they revealed earlier last week. Here's hoping the Phillies win. If they don't, the most recognizable sports mascot in North America will no longer be Philadelphia's beloved monopoly. Any team, theoretically, will be able to replicate the Fanatic as their own mascot. sad when the almighty dollar becomes more important than the spirit of our city. Today we're going to talk about Rocky Colavito, who played for the Cleveland Indians and Detroit Tigers. He's one of the most talented and beloved players during the 1950s and 60s. Colavito played at Reading during his early years in the Cleveland organization, and he continues to live in the Reading area. Over a 14-year Major League career, Colavito hit 374 home runs and 1,159 RBI. He was the fifth player in American League history to have 11 consecutive 20-home run seasons between 1956 and 1966 and exceeded 40 home runs 3 times and 100 RBI 6 times during that span. When Rocky retired in 1968, Colavito had hit more career home runs than any other right-handed hitter in the American League except for Jimmy Fox and Harmon Killebrew. The new metrics have only added to Colavito's impressive credentials. They indicate that between 1956 and 66, The Rock, as he was popularly known, was among the top 10 players in wins above replacement, offensive WAR, on-base plus slugging, and adjusted OPS. Yet for all his achievements and his exemplary character, Rocky Colavito was never elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. My guest, Mark Sommer, an award-winning journalist for the Buffalo News, has written a fascinating new biography on Colavito titled Rocky Colavito, Cleveland's Iconic Slugger. The book is the most comprehensive account of the Indian star's storied career. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you.
And thanks for being so patient and putting up with the fanatic rant. But as you can tell, I'm very passionate about that topic in particular. So,
and I found this fascinating. I knew very little about the topic, and now I'm really curious to see what happens going forward.
Yeah, so am I. Let's begin with you, though. You got a fascinating background. How does a Yankee fan who grew up in California end up writing a biography on Rocky Colavito, who was a legend in Cleveland?
Well, that's not an unreasonable question to wonder. I grew up in Austin, New York, until I was 8 years old, and I moved to Southern California with my family. And at the age of 10, I discovered baseball. Living in Southern California, I listened to Angels games and I listened to Dodgers games as well. I say listen because honestly, most games were still on the radio and not as often on television. I just soaked up everything I could as a kid with baseball, and became familiar, like so many kids, with all of the players who were playing, in this case in both leagues, because I could hear the Angels games and the Dodgers games. And Rocky Colavito was quickly one of my favorite players. I can only conclude, looking back, that it had to do in part with his name, cool name, Rocky Colavito, the fact that he was a home run hitter, that he was a handsome ball player, held his bat up high. A lot of things that came together without me, I'm sure, even being quite conscious of it. In following Rocky is one of my favorite players. Now, as a Yankees fan, I'm old enough to remember Mantle and Maris. Those were the two top players in my eyes. But Rocky, Willie Mays over with the Giants, playing against the Dodgers, and a number of other players were way up there too. So fast forward, 50 years basically, and I was looking online one day, a little more than 3 years ago now, and wondering, what had happened to Rocky. Hadn't heard much about him. I was aware that the Cleveland Indians had never retired his uniform number or erected a statue in his honor at the ballpark. And I had heard, different things about what might have happened to him in the years after he had played ball. So I looked up how many books have been written about him, just really out of curiosity or with the interest of maybe buying a book about Rocky to catch up. And the only book that I came upon, the only biography written about Rocky Colavito, appeared in 1966. It was written by an Indians columnist named Gordon Cobbledich. I had read that book. I read the book when I was 13. In fact, I used bar mitzvah money on the book to purchase it without telling my parents, which was the first time I remember doing something like that. So I had read the book at the time and I just couldn't believe that was the only book written about him so many years later. And Rocky in 66 had returned to the Indians the year before for a second term of duty with the Indians, and still had a couple more years to play after that. So that just got the wheel spinning. I work as a journalist at the Buffalo News, but I had never actually written a book. But I knew how popular Rocky continued to be in Cleveland, and I thought he had such a fascinating career. And there were a lot of questions I had, like why wasn't he in the Hall of Fame, and like what I had mentioned earlier about the Indians seemingly not recognizing him for the absolute star and really critical player that he had been during his years as an Indian. So that got things going, and I contacted a publisher, and they were interested. I contacted the Indians to put me in touch with Rocky, and started taking notes the first time I talked to him, and a year later had a manuscript, and the year after that the book was published.
Now, you mentioned the Cobbledich book, which is titled Don't Knock the Rock. That was written in 1966. But Rocky wasn't that forthcoming with Cobbledich as he was with you about his feelings on some subjects. What were some of those subjects that he did disclose his feelings on, and why did he hold back with Cobbledich?
Yeah, when I talked to Rocky about writing a book about him, he was very receptive. I think he had kind of hoped that might happen someday. And he would tell me on a number of occasions, he'd let me know that how much he regretted not speaking more openly about his feelings toward particularly some general managers that he had had to work with over the years, starting with, of course, Frank Lane, one of the great villains in Cleveland sports history. Frank Lane being the general manager who traded Rocky Colavito away on April 17th, 1960 to the Detroit Tigers. But it wasn't only Frank Lane. Gabe Paul was another general manager with the Indians when Rocky returned to Cleveland that he had bad relations with over the years, and there were some other people as well. So why didn't Rocky talk more openly or forthcomingly about these people back in 66 when that book came out? Really, because nobody was doing that at that time, really until Ball 4 by Jim Bouton a couple of years later. Athletes really did not talk too openly about how they felt about their bosses or other players. So it just really wasn't done, and it would have been particularly, I would say, out of character for Rocky to have done so, because he had such a wonderful persona with the public. He was seen as a very earnest, good-natured, true fan favorite who would, after virtually every game, whenever possible, unless the team bus was going to pull out of the stadium very, very early, he would stay after the games and sign autographs for fans at home. And he just had he was just such a likable and beloved figure that for Rocky to start blasting people in the administration of the Cleveland Indians would have just been so out of character. And I had to remind him of that. And he was glad, though, to be able to speak a little more honestly about, again, people like Frank Lane for this book.
Mm-hmm. I know from personal experience, having spoken with him on several occasions over the phone, that Rocky's a very private individual, so he certainly must have been receptive to the book idea, because he loaned you his personal scrapbooks that were created by his brother Dominic and his wife Carmen. He gave permission to Bobby DiBasio, the Indians' Vice President of Public Affairs, to give you contact information to 20 of his former teammates in order to interview him, and even allowed you to reprint photos from his personal collection. All of those advantages, in addition to your style of writing, which we're going to get to a little bit later, make the book a fantastic read, and also makes me wish that you had gotten the University Press of Nebraska to do the book too. But because it would be available more easily, more accessible in bookstores. But, how did you earn his trust? He is such a very private individual.
I think that, in talking to me, Rocky realized that at the very least, I kind of knew my stuff in terms of baseball. I knew a lot about his career. I knew a lot of details that I could tell he appreciated it, and would be a little surprised that I would know different things, I guess, about his life and about the era in which he played and other players. It's funny, I can't remember what I did yesterday, but I can remember really well what happened in 1962 or 64, when it comes to baseball. I have a very good memory for that stuff, and I think that was helpful. I think, Rocky was one of my favorite players, and I let him know that. And I don't know, I think we just kind of hit it off, to be honest. You never know how that kind of thing's going to go, but he seemed to like me, I guess. Not that I was trying to be liked, but we just got along well. And before long, we, kind of developed a little bit of a shtick, when we would talk, where he would like to give me a hard time, and I would give it right back to him, and just become a kind of way of talking with him in a sense that he seemed to really enjoy. So he was receptive to telling his story. I think he just needed to feel that I would be capable enough to tell his story, and he clearly gave me a certain amount of trust from the outset, and hopefully I earned it.
Well, he certainly must have, because you spent over 100 hours interviewing Rocky for this book.
Honestly, it was probably closer to 1,000. It was hundreds, and if I added them all up, I would bet probably over 1,000 hours. Wow.
One of the things you mentioned, which I caught on to from the conversations I had with him, which were well under even 20 hours, was his razor-sharp memory. What else impressed you about Rocky?
His modesty is really, especially in this day and age, perhaps. But he's such a modest person. When he would tell me stories continually, if I would say, "Hey, Rocky, can you tell me about fill in the blank?" The 4 home run game comes to mind at the moment, but whatever it would be, and he'll say, "Well, I say this in modesty." He hates thinking anybody would believe he's bragging about his accomplishments on the field, and he never wants to be seen that way. So his modesty is something to behold, really. He demonstrated it again and again and again, and that was one thing. His just keen level of detail. Like, he would tell me about a game, for instance, and he would remember where the ball had hit the bat. And, he didn't think that baseball was a game of inches. He thought baseball was a game of a quarter of an inch. And that much of a difference could determine the trajectory of the ball or how far the ball was going to go. So I remember asking him, basically the way I worked on the book with Rocky is there were a lot of things that I wondered about and wanted to ask him about. And they were, I framed them chronologically. But then, and I did 36 sessions, I call them, where I went through that. And then when I started to write the book, I would go back over what we had talked about to see if I could jog his memory with anything else. I would also go over and make sure what I had was accurate. But I remember talking to him about his first year in the minor leagues, and when he was in Florida, Class D ball, and his description of the rooming house he was in, and the buildings on the street, and just like the details, like he just painted such a picture of it. And I'm thinking, this is 1951, and he can recall with such detail so much, and that's Rocky. He has an extraordinary memory, really remarkable. I tell something at the start of the book about reminding him when he learned about a photograph featuring Carmen, his wife, with their firstborn, little Rocky Jr. And I said that it was a hotel employee who had told him about it, and he goes, "You're wrong." On the phone to me. I said, "What do you mean I'm wrong?" He goes, "You're wrong." I said, "I am not wrong. It was a hotel employee." He said, "It wasn't." I said, "It was." He told me it was. He goes, "Mark, it wasn't. It was an elevator operator."
Wow. Which
you could argue was a hotel employee. And then he added, her name was Lillian. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, like who remembers the name of the elevator operator in the mid-50s? And here we are talking 3 years ago. So and then he apologized that he couldn't quite remember her last name.
Oh, jeez.
Right? So that's Rocky.
One of the disadvantages of interviewing a veteran star ball player who's 85 years old is that there are a lot of principal characters in his career who have passed on. Rocky was very close example to Hank Greenberg, which was, I think, the first general manager of Cleveland when he went up there. Greenberg was gone. We talked about Frank Lane. He was gone. Joe Falls, a sports writer who covered him in Detroit, he was gone. But on the other hand, there's still a lot of guys who are around, and the cast of characters that you interviewed is extremely impressive. I mean, we've got guys like Luis Tiant, Sam McDowell, down to a later generation of Cleveland Indians like Ray Fosse. You interviewed Al Kaline. Who else did you interview, and what did you learn from them about Rocky?
Well, yeah, thanks. I would first say that I was able to interview a lot of his peers, but it was the older generation that I was unable to interview, and because they had passed away, which made it difficult, including presenting a very balanced account of Rocky's life, because the people, I would have loved to have interviewed Hank Greenberg, who Rocky just looked up to so much. But the people that he had problems with, I would have liked to have talked to them as well, including, Frank Lane, of course. But it wasn't possible because they had passed away. So in terms of teammates, there are many of his peers that are still alive. And Jim Gentile was a particularly interesting guy to talk to, who Rocky roomed with for a year when he played with the Kansas City Athletics in 1964. And then Gentile later played with Rocky at the very end of his career, a couple of years later in Cleveland. Gentile told me that Rocky was one of the three ball players in his career in the majors that he ever felt really close to. and that Rocky, it was a treat for him to be in Rocky's presence every day, to go out to dinner with him, and just he learned so much about being a good person and living kind of an honorable life through Rocky's example. I was really kind of struck by that. What I found, whether it was, Ralph Terry and Sam McDowell and Louis Tiant, or Al Kaline and Jake Wood and Willie Horton, Jim Cott I talked to, who was an opposing player, but certainly knew Rocky. You could pretty much draw. You could almost put together all of the quotes from all of the players, and you would get a composite of Rocky from one to the next as being just an extraordinarily generous person, an admirable figure that to most of these guys, Rocky kind of walked on water. He was just such an outstanding example of a great teammate, a great person, and a great ball player, of course. So here's one great story, if I can, that I think your listeners might like. When Rocky was playing with the Indians, he got off the team bus around, I think it was around 59, could have been 58, but I think it was 59, and the Indians actually had pulled into Detroit, into the ballpark there, and he saw from his window that some black teenagers were getting in some trouble, and he got out of the team bus and he walked over and he found out that they had snuck into the ballpark. And he knew a clubhouse guy, and he said, "Hey, why don't you give these kids a job? Do something for them." And the clubhouse guy did. One of those players was Willie Horton. And Willie Horton couldn't believe a player like Rocky had intervened on his behalf, and just, started, quickly Rocky was his favorite player. So Willie Horton winds up becoming a professional ball player. He's in the minor league system with Detroit, and he gets called up in 63. And in 63, Rocky knew he was on his way out with the Tigers. He had a pretty ugly contract negotiation in the off season, and then he had his worst year in the majors in 63. He just didn't hit well, and he kind of knew the writing was on the wall and had heard a few things as well. So when Willie Horton got called up, he took Willie aside and said, "Look, I'm going to teach you everything I know. You're going to be my replacement." And Willie Horton, to interview him, he's so emotional talking about Rocky because he just thinks Rocky's the greatest guy ever. And but so did so many of his teammates.
Well, for that era, for a guy like Rocky to take a rookie player under his wing and teach him everything that he knows about the outfield and about hitting, that was so highly unusual, because veteran players, as you know, really resented the kids coming up, and they did everything to make their lives miserable. So that was really, truly exceptional. Mark, one of the many things I like about your writing is that you write in context. And in many ways, the Rocky story is the story of the American dream. The child of Italian immigrants, he worked his way up from a very modest child in the Bronx to become one of the biggest stars in Major League Baseball during the 1950s. And you give us that flavor of growing up in the Bronx and what it was like at that time. You also really emphasize, Rocky's character, and the operative word here about his time in professional baseball is worked. You write that in 1951, Rocky was among 200 young ball players at an Indiansville tryout camp, and from that group, he would become only one of two players to reach the big leagues. Tell us about Rocky's rise through the Indians minor league system and how his work ethic allowed him to make it to the majors.
He was only 17 when he got signed. He had dropped out of high school, something that he never wanted. or at least years later, he never wanted anyone to really know about, because he didn't want to set a poor example for young people. But he got fined at the age of 17 after getting a special waiver from the commissioner's office to be able to be signed. Kind of a hardship situation is the way that they categorized it. And he excelled from the outset. He led the first minor league team he played for. He led the league in home runs, and then had a number of excellent seasons, including with Indianapolis. He still holds the single season record to this day for home runs. And he also was an outstanding right fielder. I don't think we said anything about his fielding, or particularly his throwing, I should say. I mean, he was a good fielder, but he suffered from a lack of speed from having flat feet. So Rocky learned to become a much better fielder by knowing how to position batters and preparation and stuff. But that first step was not his strong suit. But he had an arm like nobody. I mean, there are those who insist that Rocky may have had the strongest arm in the history of baseball.
That's what Bill Jenkinson says. Bill Jenkinson, the baseball historian, says that Colavito had all time the strongest arm in baseball.
Yes, and Rocky has he's shown me autographed pictures in his house of Bob Feller saying something like to the Rock, the strongest you have the strongest arm ever. I'm paraphrasing. Mickey Mantle once told someone that Rocky knew that he had the strongest arm he had ever seen. Hank Greenberg said something along those lines. He did have a phenomenal arm, and I go into the book about all these different throwing exhibitions that he participated in. And threw a ball, I hope I don't mess this up, I think it was 438 feet and 10 inches, if I'm not mistaken, which at that time was 8 feet shy of, the longest throw that anyone had recorded. And that particular throwing session, Rocky said his farthest throw wasn't measured that afternoon, that he believed went even further. So he did have just an astonishing arm. But Rocky worked hard in the minors. Unlike today, usually we're stuck in the minors, for more years before you got a chance at the major league level. He did get his first shot at the age of 22 in September of 55, and later that month he got 4 hits in a game, and was starting to get on his way. He struggled a bit the following year. He went back into the minors and played for San Diego for about 5 or 6 weeks, but then was called back and was back to stay at that point.
Yeah, it's that September 55 call-up was the same month that my uncle Stan Pavlovsky was called up. He was also with the Cleveland Indians and went through the minors with Rocky at both Reading and Indianapolis. And he was, my uncle Stan, when I was a kid, would tell me about those days, in particular about Rocky, and really had a lot of respect for him. And the Indians were, after the 54 season in the series, they were rebuilding. And I've always felt, gee, it's a shame free agency wasn't around, because I think my Uncle Stan would have gotten a much longer look than the Indians gave him. So now, one of the things that you mentioned earlier is the April 17, 1960 trade that General Manager Frank Lane made, sending Rocky, who was the 1959 American League home run champion, to the Detroit Tigers for the 1959 AL batting champion, Harvey Kuhn. Afterwards, the Indians swiftly dropped in the standings from a contender to a perennial loser. Years later, Cleveland sports writer Terry Pluto would write a book attributing the poor fortunes of the organization to the so-called Curse of Rocky Colavito, and that's the title of the book. How about it, Mark? Did Rocky curse the Indians after that trade?
He didn't, but you know what? You could pretty much say it was the curse of Frank Lane.
Yeah, I think you're more. Yes.
Because Rocky, he was an unwitting player in this. You know, he didn't want to. Unlike a lot of great Cleveland sports stars, you know, say LeBron James or Jim Thome, who chose to leave Cleveland. Rocky never wanted to leave Cleveland, not when he got traded in 1960 and not when he got traded again in 1967. So he certainly never cast a curse on Cleveland. But you could say that Frank Lane, if there's a curse that was put out into the universe, it was put out by Frank Lane for trading Rocky. He was pretty amused by the title of that book and gave him a little kind of recognition after not being in the spotlight for a bit. When Terry Pluto's book came out, and there was a chapter in that book about the trade and so forth. But you know, Rocky never put any real stock in any of that. Although when I did my book, I talked to people who think, hey, the curse is real, and the curse is seen as being more than just baseball itself, but just many of the kind of problems that befell Cleveland in the 60s and 70s and 80s that had to do with deindustrialization and environmental problems, you know, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, or just, you know, Cleveland suffered a lot of population decline, which it still struggles with, but it's in a lot better shape now than it had been for a while. And so the Curse of Colavito became a kind of catchphrase, I think, for just a lot of other things that had happened to Cleveland.
One of the things I learned after your book came out was that you reached out to Paul Dolan, a co-owner of the Cleveland Indians, to see if he'd be willing to allow Rocky to be part of the festivities of the 2019 All-Star Game that was held at Cleveland's Progressive Field. But apparently Dolan never responded. So in the July days preceding the All-Star Game, you rented out the State Theater in downtown Cleveland for a program entitled it The Return of Rocky Colavito, which drew hundreds of fans. There was a moderated discussion with Rocky and former teammates Vern Fuller, Sam McDowell, and Louis Tiant, and you did a reading of your book. Tell us about that event. That must have been really, really emotional for The Rock.
It was. I just want to say, Bill, I love how you really do your homework on it. With all your questions. You're very thorough, and it's very appreciated.
So thank you.
So, So when I was working on the book here in Buffalo, where I'm talking to you from, I realized one day that the All-Star Game, and I'm a huge All-Star Game fan. I just have to say I've watched every game since 1963, and I'm a huge American League fan. And so 19 of the first 20 years that I watched the All-Star Game, the American League lost. And it was only until just a couple of years ago that the American League once again took the lead over the National League and wins. And I don't know how many people still care about this sort of thing, but I do. So I was so excited to see the American League back on top over the National League. And it turns out Rocky feels just as strongly about the American League versus the National League in All-Star games. But anyway, having said that, I realized when I realized the Indians were going to host the game in 2019, I thought, wow, my book should be coming out somewhere around then. So I just got to convince the publisher to get the book out before the All-Star Game, and I've got to figure out a way to bring Rocky back to Cleveland, because Rocky he'd been traded away twice. He came back as a coach with the Indians, and he was was ultimately fired in his last position with the Indians. And then there had never been any kind of community celebration of Rocky outside of when Rocky had come back a few times to throw out a first ball to be inducted into the Team Hall of Fame. And when he turned 80, there was a party for him for a couple hundred people at the stadium, and he threw out the first ball of the game that afternoon. But there had never been anything like in a theater setting where Rocky had a chance to answer questions from fans, to just feel the affection that fans felt toward him, and for him to share stories and let people know how much it had meant to him to be a Cleveland Indian. So I rented the State Theater, as you mentioned, and we had about 800 people that came on July 5th, so it was 4 days before the All-Star game. Bob DiBiasio was the moderator, and I think it was a really wonderful night. Rocky spent 2 hours with a meet and greet, where people got to meet him and got an autographed copy of the book. And then the program after that, after about a 45-minute break, he did it was a 3-hour program. So it was quite a night. I know it meant an enormous amount to him. We were able to get a proclamation from the city of Cleveland declaring it Rocky Colavito Day, which kind of added to the festivities. And his fans were just enthralled. I mean, I've heard from so many about what that night meant to them, and I know from Rocky it meant an enormous amount to him as well. And so I guess I wanted to try to bring some closure in a way to Rocky's situation in Cleveland. It was a great night, and I'm glad to be able to say that night, earlier that night at the theater, I wound up having a conversation with a few people that turned into the Rocky Colavito Statue Committee, and we are raising money right now to erect a life-size statue of Rocky, not at the Cleveland ballpark, where a lot of people have long felt there should be a statue. But the Indians have a policy that if you're not in the Hall of Fame, you can't be considered. So leaving that as it is, this life-size statue by David Deming, the great ball player sculptor who did Frank Robinson and Larry Doby and Jim Tomei at the Indians ballpark, Otto Graham and Jim Brown at the Brown Stadium. He has already finished a life-size statue of Rocky Colavito. And when we finish raising the money for this, that statue, possibly this year, but if not next year, is going to be standing in Cleveland's Little Italy at Tony Brush Park. So we're very excited about that. And the image that the sculptor is using is an image that Rocky himself selected.
How can listeners contribute to that statue initiative?
Yeah, so we've just begun a fundraising effort on that. Give me 1 second, and I will be glad to tell you.
As you're, I guess, pulling up some of the website information, one of the things I found fascinating about the book is a discussion of Rocky's Hall of Fame worthiness, and you have two individuals in the appendices who are SABR members and, dare I say, stat geeks. One is Adam Dorowski, and the other one is Brian Hayes. Hayes, I guess, comes to the conclusion that Rocky, in terms of his overall ability, career numbers, and the new metrics, measures up with other Hall of Fame players. Whereas Hayes does say that he kind of had hard luck in terms of major awards, which is one of the things that's serving as an obstacle. The other thing is career longevity, which is not in Rocky's favor. But, I've looked at these numbers myself, and for the time that Rocky played, he clearly is among the elite players of that time period. And I think his case should be, at the very least, reconsidered by the Golden Days Committee.
Mm-hmm. I certainly would agree with you. As we know, there's a certain amount of politics that can go into the Hall of Fame consideration. Bill James wrote a book about that, Whatever Happened to the Hall of Fame, and gave a lot of examples of that. It's a strange thing to me. Rocky retires in 1968. He's ranked 15th all time in home runs, third, as you said in your intro, for right-handed American League batters. That's for the history of baseball, and yet Rocky barely got a notice in the Hall of Fame voting. He barely registered, and that was that. So it would be, especially with what we've seen with players like Harold Baines and Ted Simmons most recently, it almost seems crazy to me that Rocky not be reconsidered at the very least for his Hall of Fame worthiness.
Well, I certainly hope he is, and the statue initiative should hopefully, re-inspire some interest in that career. Do you have information on how listeners can contribute?
I do. First, I would suggest people go to Rocky Colavito Statue for Cleveland on Facebook.
Okay.
We've got a new Facebook page up on it. So that's Rocky Colavito Statue for Cleveland on Facebook. And there's, all the information. We're looking for people to contribute to want to have their names on a decorative brick wall that will be there. That will be surrounding the statue. And there's different price levels on how to contribute to that. But it's a way for anyone who is a fan of Rockies to be a part of it, and we hope the public will want to do that.
Thank you. I've been speaking with Mark Sommer, author of Rocky Colavito, Cleveland's iconic slugger, published by McFarland Books. Last year, you can find the book online at Amazon Books or order it directly from the publisher at www.mcfarlandpub.com. And believe me, it is a very insightful and comprehensive treatment of the career of one of the greatest players from the 50s and 60s. Mark, thanks for joining us and for a wonderful biography of Rocky. I'm sure he appreciates all your efforts.
Thank you, Bill. It's really been my pleasure to talk to you. If I may, if people want to go to another place to buy the book, they can go to my website, which is RockyColavitoBiography.com. And if they type in the words "The Rock" in capital letters, 2 words, they can take $5 off the cover price, and I'll send a signed copy of the book.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Mark. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Cachetis, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.